Good morning everybody and welcome to the Wellbeing in the Workplace session. I'm sure it will be very interesting and very informative. My name's Rachel Hollinshead-Walker and to my right first we have Professor Elizabeth Libby Burton, and second we have Professor Franco Cappuccio, and right on the end we have Professor Nick Chater, who will introduce themselves and their background and interests more fully shortly. So this morning, the panel will be bringing together a variety of perspectives to discuss issues relating to wellbeing in the workplace, looking at the effects upon our wellbeing in relation to the environment in which we work, our sleep patterns, diet, and how decisions we or others may make impacts upon our working environment. The format of the session will firstly include an introduction to the topic area, the panel, who again will say a little bit about themselves and the perspective they'll bring to the session, and any opening thoughts. Audience participation is strongly encouraged, and we do have roving mics here for any questions or issues you would like to raise or any experiences you'd like to share. The session is anticipated to last around 45 minutes. We are running slightly late, so we will crack on with it. So first of all, I'll start off by giving you some introductory facts and figures and information around wellbeing in the workplace. Wellbeing in the workplace is becoming an increasing area of concern for both employees, employers, health and other related services. 1 in 6 workers is experiencing depression, anxiety or stress, which is costing the UK economy up to 26 billion per year in reduced productivity, lost working days and staff retention, staff leaving. We spend on average 60% of our waking hours in the workplace, so that's over half our lives almost, and during that time consume 1/3 of our daily calorie intake. What we choose or what our actual choices are in work are an issue. What we choose to eat and drink affects our physical and mental health, in turn affecting our professional performance. Factors which impact upon wellbeing in the workplace are wide and varied, and they include the environment itself, the physical environment, as well as the psychological and social environment. The relationship between sleep patterns, diet and physical health also have a major impact upon the working environment, as does decision-making processes at work, either by the individual, the impact on the individual, the managers, the employers. For example, in relation to managing change and continual change in the workplace. All of these factors can compound an individual's well-being in the workplace. For an example, if an individual is stressed at work and feeling depressed, this can affect eating and sleep patterns, decision-making, physical and mental health. Equally, not eating properly in the first place, or not getting enough sleep, or not being able to make those lifestyle choices, the environment and the lack of participation in decision-making can contribute to poor mental health and well-being manifesting itself. So that's just an introduction to our session. I'll now briefly introduce myself and then I'll move on to the panel who will introduce themselves. So my name's Rachel Hollinshead-Walker. I've spent 15 years working in the mental health field, working with children, young people, adults and older people. The children starting generally, well, from babies, because my interest is in perinatal and parental mental health, through to school age, to young people, adolescents, adults and older people, both as a practitioner and as a manager. I'm currently a senior manager at Coventry and Warwickshire Mind Mental Health Charity, with a lead responsibility for supported accommodation, stress and anxiety management services. I have a degree from Coventry University in social science, which I got quite a few years ago, and a master's in social work from the University of Warwick. As I said, my current interests are perinatal mental health. I'm currently studying at St Mary's College in London for a BSc in clinical hypnotherapy. So that's myself, and I'll move on to Professor Franco.
Oh, right.
Thanks.
Yeah, my name is Franco Cappuccio. I'm work in the medical school, and I trained in medicine, and then specialized in cardiovascular medicine throughout my career, and then in epidemiology and public health. Epidemiology is the science that studies the pattern of disease in populations rather than individuals and the impact on public health. My interest in research lies into the effects of lifestyle and diet in general in relation to both well-being, so the preventive aspects of lifestyle and diet, but also in the causality of ill health, how much some of these factors may cause ill health in different circumstances, particularly on chronic conditions. And I, in the last few years, have been heading the WHO Collaborating Centre for Nutrition based at Warwick, and I engage quite actively with WHO globally for some public health policies on some dietary nutritional aspect. I think my major interest in one thing, as an open thought for discussion later, rotates around the dichotomy, the contrast between how much well-being or control of ill health is due to personal choices and how much is in fact due to the presence of an enabling environment, sometimes independent on the individual, which can empower the individual then to make healthy choices.
Thank you very much, Professor Cappuccio. I hope I've got that pronunciation right. I'd now like to introduce Professor Libby Burton. Thank you, Libby.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm actually an architect and urban designer by background, but when I trained as an architect, I quickly became very disillusioned because I kept being told to stop thinking about people when I was designing and to think about the building of sculpture, which is not why I went into architecture. So what I've done since completing my training is to take up an academic career, and in 2004 I set up the WISE research unit, which stands for Wellbeing in Sustainable Environments. And the aim of that research unit is to find out how the built environment at all scales, that's from your home to your workplace, the streets we walk along, the neighbourhoods we live in, how those aspects of the built environment affect us as people, our everyday lives, our happiness, our quality of life, our mental health, even our physical health. And so we're trying to find out the knowledge that we need in order to be able to design better environments. So I've come to Warwick. I've only been here for about 18 months now, but what I want to do is set up a new set of courses and programs which provide an alternative to the current kind of education that architects get, because architecture at the moment is very much an art, and I think actually what we need to do is bring back the people element to architecture, because what we know now is actually there's quite a lot of evidence that where we live, where we work, the environments we spend our time in actually do make a significant difference to our happiness and well-being, even our physical health. The problem is having that knowledge isn't going to make any difference unless we use it to change the environments we live in. So what I'm trying to do is promote what I call design for well-being in the built environment. And that involves training a new generation of designers who know how to do that, that they put people at the centre of the design process and they use evidence of what works and what doesn't. Because you find in the past, the modernists, for example, they did have a strong social agenda, they did want to make life better for people, but they got it wrong. You know, look at the concrete high-rise tower blocks that people still live in. They got it wrong because they used their own ideas about what would work rather than tried and tested measures or any evidence. So what I'm trying to do is encourage an approach which uses evidence as the basis for design. So that's where I'm coming from, and that's what my interest is in this area.
Thank you very much, Libby. Now I'd like to welcome and introduce Professor Nick Chater.
Great.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you very much, Rachel. So my name is Nick Chater. I'm Professor of Behavioural Science and Head of the Behavioural Science Group at the Business School. My background is psychology, so I was in fact a professor for 9 years at Warwick before going to UCL for 5 years and then finally coming back again. And the the project that we're engaged in at the business school is building an interdisciplinary group of economists and psychologists to try to understand economically relevant human behaviour, but from a point of view which is much richer than that taken by standard economics, which actually models some of the crucial elements of the psychology of individual behaviour to understand how business and economic decisions get made. In the context of well-being in the workplace, there's a lot of work, much of it done at Warwick, on issues of well-being and the determinants of well-being. And I want to highlight two factors which are particularly work-related. One of which is having a sense of a meaningful purpose, a kind of clear sense of what the objectives you have are. And one issue that arises, I think, a great deal in the workplace is people being very unclear about what their goals are, or having multiple conflicting goals, possibly driven by either the same confused manager or possibly different forces within the organisation. And to the extent that you have these conflicting goals, or goals which are impossible to fulfil, then that's extremely difficult to cope with. And the other so one determinant of happiness is having a meaningful sense of engagement with goals that you believe in and can achieve. The other one I want to mention is social relationships, which are very important at every aspect of human life. But in the workplace, of course, those relationships are also mixed up with relationships of power, and that can be very difficult to deal with. So I think the degree to which we can design organisations and working environments so that people can feel comfortable and have natural cooperative social relationships while still achieving a coordinated activity that's required of a corporation or a government department or any other kind of grouping of people who have to work together, that's a real challenge, because obviously the purpose of organisations is to achieve goals which are not necessarily the goals of the individual person, and to come to views as an organisation which may not be the views of the individual people within that organisation. So that there's a sort of drive to coordinate people and to act as a coherent organisation, which is inherently, to some extent, in tension with our natural social relations. So I think those are sort of two big forces that are in play, which I think are very interesting to explore.
Okay, thank you very much. Have we got any initial questions to any of the panel? If you'd just like to raise your hand, and then the roving mics can manoeuvre around. Well, I've got quite a few questions actually. Oh, here we go. Yeah, thank you very much.
So what's your view on open plan offices then?
That's me probably. Well, well, research has been carried out on the effects of open plan offices versus what we call cellular type offices. And yes, we do find that open plan offices are worse for well-being than cellular offices. I think it's probably a bit more complex than it just being good or bad, because it depends on how it's designed. And one of the problems with research in this area is you tend to look at very broad characteristics of the environment without looking at the detail. So it may be that an open plan office would work if, for example, people were able to personalise their own space and create their own little micro environment. We also know actually that medium-sized and small open plan offices are worse than the big ones. And I think the reason for that is that in a big open plan area, you've got a general buzz in the background of noise, which hides individual conversations. Whereas if you're you probably all of you experienced this, I certainly have, if you're in a small area that's open plan, one conversation, you can't help but listen into it, So yeah, we do know that open plan is bad.
Thank you very much.
Another thing, just to add to that briefly, that people often report is the feeling uncomfortable by being continually under observation. So certainly a lot of very open buildings with lots of glass in them, even if they're not open plan offices, where everyone can see everybody else. And I think for many people that makes them extremely uncomfortable. So I think there's another sort of factor. One is the sort of background noise and intrusion, but the other factor is just feeling you don't have a proper private hidden space.
And the other thing to add to that, Nick, is that unless you have the privacy you need, you tend not to want to interact with other people, so you don't get the good relationships with other people either. So you have to satisfy that privacy need first.
So a compounded effect there, really. Thank you.
Lots of questions.
Have you correlated that with organisational performance in terms of the office design and team performance? Is there a link between the design of the office and the team performance out the other end?
Well, certainly in terms of productivity, if that's what you mean, workers are less productive in an open plan environment, and it also matters how many people there are in the space, so the density of the space, how many people per square metre. So if you've got a packed open plan office, productivity is significantly lower. So you could make an economic case for changing it. Thank you.
Just to pick up on that point, having worked in open plan for most of my 30 years, I'm surprised with that conclusion, particularly for teamwork.
Right.
Open plan can be very productive. I take your point on privacy, there is a balance, yeah. But I think I've found where environments where people have had the opportunity to have their sort of private conversations or private calls in a separate place, that sort of work. Yeah. But I'm surprised that open plan wouldn't be seen as good for teamwork.
Yeah, well, you're quite right. That's a good point. That's what I was saying before about it being more complicated than that. And actually, the space has got to be fit for the purpose, and it depends what sort of work you're doing. So, if you're in a design, advertising office, it's a lot about image and style and the impression you give to the client. That's all important. You might be in an environment where actually you want to encourage ideas, the exchange of ideas between people. And so, it depends what sort of work it is. For some work, the exchange between people is really, really important. And that's something else we've been looking at, is how do you create an environment that allows people to interact without disturbing other people? It's very complicated, but you're right that there are some good aspects to open plan spaces.
I mean, another thing to add on that is the importance of optionality. So if you can only work in an open plan space where there are people all around you, and you have something to do which requires intense concentration, like writing a briefing paper, then that's a nightmarish experience. So in an environment where, on the other hand, you can work from home, you can work in secluded areas, or you can work in an open plan as is appropriate, then that's a very different kettle of fish. So I think the degree of flexibility people have about how they distribute their work has a big impact. And it certainly is absolutely true that when people are separated, they also report actually quite a lot of symptoms of stress and distress. It's not a pleasant environment for everybody to be in a sealed box if they have no sense of humanity around them at all. And certainly many old-fashioned office environments do have that quality.
I think it's an important point, as Nick says, because actually what's crucial is having control over your environment. So I think the reason why open plan offices often come out as negative is because people have less control. Can you open the window? Can you change your space and make it suit your needs for that particular day? But if you changed open plan office design so that you could have more control over it, then they may work perfectly fine.
Thank you.
Just a final observation of that. I do notice behaviour where some people wear headphones to do that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
It interests me about workplaces being taken into environments that perhaps there were never before. For instance, the train. I went to London recently and I find I'm sitting at a table and I'm in a business conference. Now that in itself is impacting on me and I'm not even working there, so that perhaps is another thing to consider.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I'm not I mean, people have been looking at the implications of working from home, but I don't know about extending it to those more public environments. I think that would be really interesting, actually, to explore. I don't know, Nick, do you know?
No, I didn't. I mean, I know there's a little bit of stuff. There's actually a lot of research in basic psychology on the effects, the stressful effects of interfering noise. So if you are the person on the, just inadvertently listening into a business meeting, then that is likely to be quite difficult, because it's actually very, very mentally effortful to block out information. So either you have to listen to it, which you don't particularly want to do, or you fight it, but you can't really fight it. So it's actually a very stressful experience. So there's no question that's a negative thing. For the question of how productive people are in transit, that's a very interesting question. I'm sure there must be work on it. I don't know what it is. That's not an area I've ever looked at.
If I may just take the opportunity to move into another aspect. I mean, the example of working on the train is probably the obvious aspect that everyone can see in terms of moving the working environment into new spaces. That is a time for traveling, it's not time for working. Now, that opens up the idea that we've been studying in terms of the effect on well-being and the reduction in sleeping time over the last 50, 60, 70 years in the Western world. And if you were able to peep into somebody's house, you probably realize that more and more people work late in the evening or in the early hours of the morning, finishing off their report, using the computer in bed or checking the latest email before switching the light. Now, that has been shown very clearly to encroach into a time where you should spend being asleep. And that's what we've been studying. And this is one other aspect of sleep, not only in the working place, related to shift work and working night or in extended hours, which is a well-established science, and there are some deleterious effects. But the more subtle curtailment of sleeping time is the only commodity you can trade off nowadays, can you? You have your busy life, you have to get up in the morning, you get your entry time to work or to school for children. It's all very much into boxes, and you come home and that you're shopping, then you get to cook your meal if you're a mum, and then you need to have a bit of your social life. And where you can squeeze things in your sleeping time. So if you notice over the last 60, 70 years, populations have reduced their average sleeping times from an average of 9 hours per night to what is less than 6 hours per night. And our research has shown that this is really bringing over a lot of consequences, not only in the short term, your tiredness, your fatigue, which in the working place reflects in the loss of productivity, efficiency, but also in the longer term. We're now showing a greater incidence of hypertension, diabetes, heart disease, and other conditions of that kind. So in reality, going back to your example of the train, really brings to my mind that a lot of people bring their work at home in spaces that should not be taken by. And that brings it back to how much is a personal choice, how much is an enabling environment. My personal feel and the research we do is that a lot is due to outside pressures. So we don't have an enabling environment. Demands is greater and greater. Traveling time is greater. For instance, you spend more time to go to work, for instance, and we go back to how to enable an environment to get you to work, not only in a healthier way, by bike or public transport and greener means of transport, but also in the quickest possible time, so you can maximize your time. So I'd like to know whether anyone has any ideas or any questions or observations on this particular aspect.
It's very interesting, the dichotomy that yourself has pointed out, in that lifestyle choices, and that individuals may be aware of those lifestyle choices and fully educated around those choices, but unable to implement them for various different reasons. The external constraints of lack of control over those, pressure from work, and you talked about sleep, and I'm sure kind of diet would come into that.
Yeah. I was going to ask, actually, it's hard to know which way it goes, whether it's working longer and more efficiently and trying to pack as much in the day as you can, or whether it's actually working more flexibly, enabling you to have a better work-life balance. And I wonder what your views are on that, on which way it's going.
I think you're quite right that there are two forces, the two phenomena running along side by side. So to some extent, the boundary between work and leisure is becoming increasingly blurred, and technology is increasing that degree of blurring, and it will do so even more. So it's going to be increasingly difficult to make a distinction between work that has to be done in the office and work that has to be done at home. So that can be dangerous, because it can make everybody feel that they have to be on sort of permanent standby to work at any moment, or to catch up on all the work they didn't do in the office. But actually, I think in the long term, I think there's actually a positive opportunity there, which you pointed to, which I think is actually greater and will overwhelm the negative. If we as a society take the right choices anyway, which is that it allows us to work under actually conditions, again going back to the issue of choice, it allows us to work when we want to work. So an enormous amount of work, quotes work, inverted commas, is actually spurious from the point of view and irrelevant for the purposes of the organisation. An awful lot of it is, in economic terms, a thing called signalling. So it's me doing something expensive and costly to me to show that I'm committed to you as a manager or to this as an organisation or whatever it may be. So meetings are classic examples of this. So you go to meet, if you're a business person trying to sell a contract, you have to fly to Frankfurt, you go to see the client wherever they may be. Now the value, you could do that from your living room without even leaving your house, and indeed increasingly I suspect this will happen. But one of the reasons you have to do that, and we've always had the phone, at least for a very long time, the reason you have to go for that costly process of signalling is to say, I really value you, I think you're really important to me, and it's really costly and you know and I know this has cost me an awful lot of time, and that shows how much I care. Now, the degree to which we are able to unravel those kind of pointless pieces of work, we have a real opportunity. Technology gives us a real opportunity. Another aspect of signalling is being in the office early and leaving late. And I think technology is going to gradually break that down, because it will break down the relationship between office time and amount of work you do. Because to the extent that people are working remotely, then it's imperative for managers to evaluate their workers on the ground, on the basis of what they actually did, because they can't just watch them in the office a lot, if it's taking many hours of labour to do it. And to the extent that that's true, then mere presence becomes irrelevant. So I think that we have to go through a big cultural shift, and these signalling kind of issues, me sort of showing my commitment by burning up lots of my time pointlessly, these things have to be gradually squashed out of our sort of business and government culture, and we still have a huge way to go. But I think there are real opportunities. So in the long term, I'm actually quite optimistic.
Thank you.
I'd just like to actually move on from that. I mean, I actually work for a company that in the last 10 years has moved substantially into the east coast of America, and it's also outsourced a large part of its back office functions to India. So I actually tend to have at the beginning of the day, it's sort of talking to quite often people in India. At the end of the day, it's actually America, and the Americans and Indians have because of the actual time shift there at the other side of the world, actually great difficulty if they do have to communicate with one another. Do you foresee that being a focus, which does mean that in fact last weekend we had an IT upgrade, I did spend the Sunday morning making several conference calls from home, which was much more preferable than going to the office. Do you foresee that is the way? I mean, it's certainly the way we've moved forward, and I can't see, certainly at the senior level, that changing as we become a more global types of organisations and expectations there.
Very, very quickly from my side on that, I was at a conference organised by IBM yesterday about greening the world. You might wonder why IBM. Actually, quite an interesting meeting. But one of the things that IBM are doing, and you may well be very aware, is they are moving away from having offices at all. So a very large percentage of their employees now work from home, and they are absolutely actively encouraging it. Essentially on economic grounds, it's just cheaper. They don't have to spend all that money on offices. But of course they have this extraordinary global workforce. So you've got this very, very strange phenomenon of a giant global corporation distributed across the world, where a very large proportion of its growth, and indeed now current employees, are in India. But you've got this big centre in the US and to some extent Europe. You've got this enormous global organisation which is working from the homes of its employees across the world, struggling with all these different time zone issues. I think that's very much the way. I mean, IBM. If IBM's doing it now, then we'll all be doing it in 5 or 10 years.
If I may just pick up on this and look at another aspect, which is more into the sleep-wake cycle and the balance of our metabolism in life. There's one clear example of studies carried out in the City of London where obviously within the global markets there are individuals, they start working at midnight and stop working 8 o'clock in the morning to look after the East Asian countries markets. Now that is one of the reasons, if you study them, they have a very short lifespan in terms of working life. They can't work for long times in those kind of rhythms because it's totally against your body clock. Now, if you look at the biology, it's not easy for your body to adapt to an upside down day. You know, if you travel to Australia, it takes probably 24 days to adapt to the new body clock, very slowly and steadily. But if you do it in an environment where you work at night and you're supposed to sleep during the day, you will turn your metabolism upside down, and the effects will be dramatic. The extreme will be heart disease, strokes, high blood pressure, maybe depression. Obviously, is one thing. Insomnia. Now, that is an indication that when working from home, I can see the great potential, provided there is an indication and a study on how far you can go in handling your timing. Because if you're left on your own, you can take patterns of work, although in your own environment, at home, which is apparently comfortable, that will lead you to a very unhealthy lifestyle, although it's from your home. There are studies showing that, for instance, there is a certain number of shifts you can do before you really start building serious damages to your health. And we've done studies in junior doctors, for instance, were triggered by a new European working time regulation that was reducing the total number of hours that junior doctors can work from 56 to 48 hours per week. Now, that is on the understanding of health and safety issues, both for the doctors themselves, that can do harm to themselves, but also for the implications of risk for patients. Because if you work beyond a certain time, you accumulate fatigue and tiredness, your efficiency, your way of articulating even procedures declines, you can do harm. And we showed that by reducing working hours, we were improving the medical errors by 33%, by a third. In other words, if you prolong shifts, you go into an area of high risk if you have a shift longer than 11 hours. Commonly, the doctors work 13 hours shift. In the States, up to 18-hour shifts. And it's clear that between 1 and 10 hours, the rate of errors, the alertness is comparable. And then you have a very, very sharp rise. Most of the medical errors happen in the last 3 hours of the shift. Now, these are issues that are not recognized worldwide, and I think there is a risk that if you leave it to the positive attitude of passing on to your home environment, which obviously is very good for the individuals, it might leave it totally uncontrolled in terms of how much you can build of safe routines of those kind of working practices.
Thank you.
I was just wondering about the transition between work and non-work, and as we have more flexible things, we kind of lose that kind of preparing to work and then winding down from work. And if any of you had any kind of thoughts or research into how you can build that in if you're, say, working from home or something like that.
I'll pick up with a small point which is related to health, and then I'll pass it on to my colleagues. Preparation is important, particularly for those that do shift work or work late against your body clock. It's not a 9 to 5. And within, for instance, the study we did for doctors, part of the preparation to a night work would be to have naps. That will potentiate your alertness and make you ready for the night shift. Preparation means also rest and not having alcohol intake, not having intense exercise before going, but that will be detrimental to your alertness, your preparation. So there are practices in your routine which will be quite important, for instance, for shift workers. They're not always built in the schedules in different occupations. That's one example of what preparation is important, knowing the health impacts.
There's also a theory called attention restoration theory. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's this theory that we have a natural affinity with nature, and I mean it's been quite well tested as well. So if you have a view of nature, greenery, trees outside your window, if you look at that, then or spend some time in that environment, you can restore your energy much more quickly than if you're not in a more natural environment. I always was a bit doubtful about it because I'm an architect. I'm interested in built environments and not natural environments. And there's some research now which is suggesting that it depends what's pleasant to you, and it actually may not be about nature. It might be more about what you find attractive and beautiful, but we don't know very much about that. But basically, if you went outside or went to a space that was really beautiful, that would help you to restore your energy much more quickly, and your fatigue levels will be lower. And they show that actually your productivity is much better if you have a view of trees outside your window.
I think just something to say at a more prosaic level. I think they're both very important contributions. At a very prosaic level, routine is very important. So the human sort of behaviour and decision making is very driven by a tendency to do what you did before. So it's if you're working at home and you have a very variable routine, then every time you decide when shall I start work, and B, what shall I do now, you have a difficult decision to make, and that decision will will take effort, but B, will tend to be put off. So it's actually very important to have very, very simple routines that you go through every day. And if you do the same thing every day, then you don't have those decisions, because at a certain time you do what you do, and then the first thing you do is this, and off you go. And now I think there are big personality differences concerning how much routine people want. But for people who find trying to draw boundaries between their work and home life, particularly from working at home, I think it's. The standard thing is just classic sort of training, essentially. It's sort of like animal training. You need to train yourself so that when the day ends, I do this, this, and this, and then I go for a short walk, and then it's stopped. But if the more things are routine, the more clear those boundaries will be.
If I may pick up, I have and I'd like to hear both your views. In the sleep, behavioural and health area of research, one thing is very important. Our sleep-wake cycle is guided by light and darkness, and that's because the way we were. And in fact, the problems of sleep sometimes are called Edison disease, because since artificial lighting, all these problems have arisen, apart from the poles, so there have been some adjustments. And I wonder how much, for instance, lighting is considered in building the environment, which is in fact one thing which guarantees routines in individuals to go from a sleep-wake cycle. One we recommend as a routine against insomnia, that you create your routine, one of which is to create a soothing environment, dim lighting, because that will reduce your stimulus to wakefulness, and will stimulate melatonin, which puts you to sleep in a sense. Whereas if you are in a very bright light, you will find it more difficult to sleep. And this is physiological due to hormones. So, and that will guarantee the natural routine in which we have been built. So to wake up with light and go to sleep when it's dark. And I wonder, for both of you, whether you have any indication in terms of designing buildings or considering lighting, which is very important in the workplace, but also in the private environment, and the issues about routine.
Yeah, I mean, lighting is really important. When it comes to designing a building, the aim should be to increase the amount of natural daylighting so that you are exposed to those rhythms of day and night. And that has been shown to have a big impact on well-being and happiness. However, there are big contradictions really with other requirements. So, for example, if we want a low-energy building, the main mechanism is to seal it and to stop the heat escaping. So actually, windows are the worst bits of a building for heat escaping. So the aim would be to reduce the amount of window space. And actually, most buildings that we work in these days have become deeper and deeper planned. So most people don't have very much natural daylighting, and that's probably for economic reasons as much as anything else, you know. So what we need to do, what actually they are trying to do, is develop artificial lights which more closely mimic the effects or more closely like natural daylighting, because so you can get lights now which have some of the same effects as natural lighting, but I don't think we should try to go down that route. I think we should go back to trying to get the most amount of natural daylight into buildings, and we've lost that skill because in the past, before we had the electric light bulb, architects, designers were very skilled at designing buildings to get the most light in. You'll see, you know, if you look at a Victorian terrace house with the extension at the back, that was simply to get light into the back of the building. It's done very cleverly. And you see old buildings, they never have internal bathrooms. Every room has a window, whereas now we've lost the art and the skill of being able to do that. We need to recover that ability.
Thank you.
I was going to make a point actually similar to one that Nick made a moment ago, which is about personal preferences and different priorities that individuals have. And it seems to me a continuing problem excuse me, is that many of our buildings, our organisational structures, organisational cultures are still based around models which are 50, 60 years out of date. And we're being very slow to change these to reflect changing technology, changing the way people behave. There can be massive changes coming through in the sort of so-called Generation Y, the digital generation. We're going to want to do things very, very differently, and our structures and cultures, and to some extent physical buildings, don't really allow for that.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. A lot of organisational structure historically is in concern with monitoring and control. So one level you've got offices taking on the shape of factory organisations, sort of banks of workers with routinized tasks, all doing the same task. Call centres are a little bit like that now. But most organisations are actually much more fluid. They have a much richer range of tasks going on, enormous varieties of skills. So the structure of organisations and the nature of the tasks people are doing are much more diverse, and they don't really lend themselves to this sort of very, very sort of routinized approach to management. So I think, in fact, the networking of the creation of digital networks actually does change from a managerial perspective what you need anyway, because in fact you can tell perfectly well how productive people are being because everything is visible. It doesn't mean you have to invade people's privacy, but people are producing, almost everybody in an office environment at least, or an office environment now distributed across the network, is producing information of one kind or another. So it's actually very easy to monitor what people are doing. So I think a lot of the sort of hierarchical structures have a different the rationale for them is different now. That's not to say that organisations need to completely change their shape, and there's still these enormously tricky coordinative functions. In fact, coordination becomes an extremely difficult problem when you've got people with very different sets of skills, and no single manager can understand what all those skills are and whether they're being discharged successfully and whether people are working effectively or ineffectively. And it's a very tricky business. But I think it's going to be we're going to be moving away, I suspect, from very sort of strict hierarchical forms of organisation, and that is happening. I mean, the organisations are changing shape and getting flatter and more sort of heterogeneous, and also, in fact, the proportion of small organisations to which work is being outsourced is also increasing, and in fact, the amount of home working is increasing. There are all sorts of dramatic shifts that we're living through, and I think they creep up on us. But in fact, the workplace and the kind of structures most of us work in are really quite different in aggregate from what they were, say, 20 or 30 years ago.
I think we've just got time for the last two questions, if that's all right. I've just been given the signal to wind up. Thank you.
I fear my question may lead to another panel session sometime, but we're not talking about stress in the workplace. But my particular interest is decision-making and stress. Is stress important in good decision-making? I'm thinking particularly around areas of financial risk or even safety risk, a sense of chronic unease may be important to make a good decision.
Yeah, and that's a huge question, but I'll just say to keep time under control and fit the other question in, I'll say one thing about it. There's a famous and long sort of ancient law in psychology called the Yerkes-Dodson law, which says that for almost any task, if you look at the amount of stress you're under in doing that task, if you're under very low stress, you'll do it slowly and poorly. If you're under a bit more stress, you'll get better and better. And then there'll be a point, and this point will differ from one person to another, at which you suddenly get worse and worse. So there's this sort of U-shape of performance, in terms of stress level. So you need to be at the right level, but not too much. And in general, when people are certainly when people are at high levels of stress, then their performance tends to be poor, but also that tends to be rather self-perpetuating, because obviously then they become more stressed, and so you can get this kind of spiralling.
If I may add something in the health field, stress is difficult to define. Universally, stress is what is stress for you. The same task could be stressful for you, not stressful for another person. There is a huge research in social and public health from UCL, using the theory of the locus of control, whereby if you have a high demand and low control job, you have the highest level of health consequences or ill health, including heart disease. So stress causes heart disease. But if you have a high responsibility, high pressure, but high control, your level of disease is not that bad. That means that obviously you can design a 2x2 square graph and see where you are. You're doing a sort of a low demand, low control job, that's all right, as you say. But if you do a low control and high demand job, that's where you have to be worried about it. And that's where I think, in terms of health, it comes into place, how much control you have of even a highly demanding job.
Right. Unfortunately, it had to be a very brief question. You have to be very quick. I do apologise, but we're running a little bit late. If you just...
Nick, you talked earlier on about the IBM experience, and I wonder what work you've seen or they're doing on the issues of lack of socialisation, as more and more of us are working, not in joint premises.
Yes, I mean, I only know about this informally. I do know they do have some program of getting people together to meet on sort of annual bases and so on. But I think that's a real problem. That's a really serious problem. And there are little IBM offices you can go to around Europe, certainly, if you're working from home. But I think it's not a very effective strategy, and it's actually a very difficult problem.
Right. That's it. Thank you all very much. It's been I'd like to thank the panel. It's been very informative, and thank you very much for the audience participation. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.